March 19th, 1943. Near the village of Mejez El Bab in Tunisia, a German transport column rumbled through a narrow wadi at dawn. Among the trucks and armored half-tracks was a single vehicle that stood out, a captured American M4A1 Sherman tank, freshly repainted with Balkenkreuz insignia and a crude German tactical number on its turret. The tank had been seized weeks earlier during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, one of several Allied vehicles left intact on the battlefield when U.S. forces hastily withdrew. The German Army's 10th Panzer Division had recovered the Sherman with fascination. It represented the newest product of American armor design, a tank that combined mass production with engineering reliability. For German officers accustomed to the complex machinery of the Panzer IV and the delicate systems of the Tiger, the Sherman seemed both crude and ingenious. It started easily, required little maintenance, and carried ammunition in a simplified layout that astonished German mechanics. The tank was ordered sent north to Germany for technical evaluation. Its turret was marked with shipping codes and a stencil reading Beutepanzer M4 USA. Inside the hull, engineers packed boxes of spare parts, captured manuals, and ammunition samples. Oberst Karl-Heinz Straube, an ordnance liaison officer attached to Army Group Africa, was placed in charge of escorting the vehicle to Europe. His orders were precise: deliver the Sherman intact to the Heereswaffenamt testing grounds at Kummersdorf. The route would take the tank by rail from Tunis to Naples, then onward through Austria into Germany. The transport began on schedule. At each stop, local German units came to inspect the vehicle, marveling at its simplicity and spacious design. Its radial aircraft engine, noisy but dependable, ran for hours without issue, a trait rare in German machines suffering from fuel and parts shortages. Many officers quietly wondered whether the Americans had found the true formula for modern warfare. Not complexity, but abundance. The first stage of the journey went without trouble. The tank reached Naples in early April, loaded onto a flat car under tight security. But fate intervened as the transport moved north. Allied bombers struck the railway lines repeatedly, forcing detours and delays. In the confusion, the convoy was rerouted through occupied France, where logistical coordination between the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe often broke down. Outside Lyons, Straube received orders to pause and wait for repairs on a damaged section of track. While there, he met local administrators and Vichy officers who, in typical wartime bureaucracy, demanded new travel documents. During the delay, he used the opportunity to show the captured tank to a group of curious officials. He had no way of knowing that one of them, a French railway engineer secretly cooperating with the resistance, would take note of the markings, sketch the vehicle, and report its presence to Allied contacts in Switzerland. Within a week, the Allies knew that the Germans were transporting a captured American Sherman to Germany for testing. The OSS and British intelligence immediately classified the report as critical. They had long wondered how the Germans viewed the Sherman, and now there was proof they were studying it seriously. Orders were issued to locate and, if possible, destroy the transport before it crossed into Germany. But in the chaos of spring 1943, the Allied air campaign could not target one train out of thousands. The Sherman continued its journey unscathed, crossing the Rhine by May. At Kummersdorf, engineers from the Waffenprüfamt welcomed it eagerly. It was the first intact American tank ever delivered to the heart of Germany's research establishment. When the examination began, what they discovered inside the Sherman would surprise even the most skeptical of German designers. And months later, it would surprise the Americans even more. When the captured Sherman finally arrived at the Kummersdorf proving grounds in early May 1943, it was treated with the same secrecy as a new German prototype. The tank was driven into a hangar used for weapons analysis, its fresh American olive drab still visible beneath the hastily applied German markings. Engineers from Daimler-Benz, Krupp, and the Heereswaffenamt gathered to inspect it. For many of them, it was their first encounter with American armor in pristine condition. Their initial impression was surprise. The Sherman's design defied the German philosophy of engineering. It lacked the complex armor angling of the Panther or the heavy gun of the Tiger. Instead, it relied on balance: moderate armor, moderate firepower, and high mechanical reliability. When the mechanics removed the rear plates to examine the engine, they were stunned by the accessibility. The Wright Continental R975 radial engine, originally an aircraft power plant, could be serviced in hours, not days. Simplified to the extreme, one German engineer noted in his report, but functional beyond expectation. The gun, a 75mm M3, drew similar commentary. It lacked penetration against German heavy armor, but its high explosive shells were perfectly suited for infantry support. The traversing mechanism, smooth and electrically assisted, impressed testers who compared it to the slower hydraulics of the Panzer IV. Even the transmission layout fascinated them. 5 forward gears, forgiving clutch action, and a steering system that allowed inexperienced drivers to handle the tank easily. To German officers accustomed to constant mechanical breakdowns in North Africa and Russia, the Sherman seemed almost too convenient. Over several weeks, the tank was stripped and examined piece by piece. Armor samples were cut and tested for hardness. The steel was found to be of lower carbon content than German armor, but tougher under repeated impact. Ammunition racks were lined with protective coatings designed to reduce fire risk, a feature almost unknown in German tanks at the time. In one test, the Americans' wet stowage design, where shells were stored in sealed compartments with a glycol mixture, prevented ignition after a shell struck the hull. The result startled the observers. The Sherman was more survivable than they had assumed. Kummersdorf's engineers compiled a detailed 80-page analysis titled Bericht über amerikanische Kampfpanzer, M4A1, circulated to the Oberkommando des Heeres in July 1943. Its conclusion was uncharacteristically admiring. American industry has achieved an excellent compromise between quantity, maintainability, and combat readiness. This design, while mechanically simple, represents a formidable system when produced in large numbers. That line reached General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops. He recognized its significance immediately. The Sherman, he argued in his notes, represented a different kind of warfare, one where ease of production outweighed technical brilliance. In a staff meeting later that month, he warned, "If they can build 10 of these for every one of ours, we will lose by mathematics, not tactics." But the report did not remain confined to Germany. Unknown to Kummersdorf, Allied intelligence had already learned of the testing through intercepted communications. A decrypted message from Berlin to the Panzerwaffe Technical Bureau mentioned field evaluation of Beuta Panzer M4, satisfactory engine performance. The phrase appeared in a Bletchley Park intercept in late June 1943, prompting British analysts to request a full assessment from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. The irony deepened weeks later when the Americans themselves gained access to portions of the German report through a captured courier in Italy. Inside his briefcase were several copied technical summaries, proof that the Germans not only studied the Sherman, but respected it. When U.S. officers at Ordnance Headquarters read the translations, they were astonished. Germany had inadvertently given them an outsider's review of their own tank, a mirror image of how their design was perceived by the enemy. It was, in essence, a technical confession from inside the Reich, one that revealed more about German priorities than the Sherman itself. By the summer of 1943, the captured Sherman had become an object of obsession within Germany's armored development circles. Engineers at Kummersdorf and Meppen conducted live-fire tests against its armor, analyzing every aspect of its durability. Using 50mm, 75mm, and 88mm guns, they charted penetration results, angles of deflection, and post-impact spalling. What they found contradicted their assumptions. While the Sherman's armor was not especially thick, its curved cast design and internal spacing absorbed shocks better than expected. Direct hits that would shatter German flat-plate armor often failed to catastrophically breach the hull. The test revealed another critical detail. The Sherman's internal arrangement, its ammunition storage low and centralized, its crew stations clearly separated, significantly improved survival rates in the event of penetration. German tanks, though more heavily armed, were death traps when struck. Fuel lines, ammunition racks, and crew compartments were packed tightly together. The Sherman's compartmentalized layout represented a different philosophy, one that valued the soldier's survival as much as the machine's performance. To German testers, this seemed wasteful. To Allied commanders, it was the key to maintaining morale and manpower. The Kummersdorf report was circulated across Germany's armaments offices, eventually reaching Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and War Production. In the margin of one memorandum, an engineer noted, "This tank is not superior individually, but collectively it is unbeatable." That sentence summarized a growing unease within German industry. Their own designs, the Tiger and Panther, were masterpieces of engineering, but consumed time, materials, and manpower at catastrophic rates. Each required over 150,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman needed less than 40,000. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence had begun to piece together what was happening. Through ultra-decrypts and neutral sources in Switzerland, reports filtered in that German engineers were performing controlled tests on an American tank somewhere near Berlin. The OSS passed this information to Washington, where it was quietly shared with the Army Ordnance Department. The irony was not lost on the analysts. The Germans, through their own curiosity, were generating data that the Allies would soon use to their advantage. In late 1943, U.S. military attachés in London received a partial translation of the Kummersdorf Bericht. It had been intercepted in transit between Berlin and Paris, its courier captured by French partisans. The document detailed the Sherman's mobility, fuel consumption, and repair time compared to the Panzer IV. To American engineers, this was confirmation of what they had always argued internally, that the Sherman's value lay not in armor thickness or gun size, but in logistics. American strategists quickly recognized the strategic significance of the report. The German analysis offered validation from the enemy himself that the Allied production model was working. U.S. planners used the findings to reinforce the doctrine of quantity through reliability. Sherman production increased dramatically through 1944, not just because of industrial expansion, but because German data had unintentionally proved that the design philosophy was correct. Back in Germany, testing continued in early autumn. The captured Sherman was used to train anti-tank crews, simulate combat engagements, and evaluate new ammunition types. It became a standard reference vehicle for comparing armor quality and fuel efficiency. However, as Allied bombing intensified, many of these reports were lost or scattered. Only fragments would survive the war. Still, the captured tank's influence persisted. Notes from Panzer designers began referencing the American model when discussing simplified transmission systems and modular assembly. Even the late-war German Panther Ausfuhr design incorporated manufacturing shortcuts inspired, ironically, by what engineers had learned from the Sherman. None of this was known to the man who had started it all, Oberst Karl-Heinz Straube. Believing his mission complete, he had been reassigned to France, never realizing that his meticulously delivered war trophy had set off a chain reaction that would influence both sides of the conflict. By autumn 1943, the captured Sherman at Kummersdorf had evolved from a curiosity into a benchmark. It was used in mechanical endurance trials alongside a Panzer IV and a Panther, with data meticulously recorded by German engineers. Over a 500-kilometer test, the American tank required only minor adjustments, a belt tensioning and a spark plug replacement, while both German vehicles needed major servicing. The test reports circulated among Wehrmacht maintenance officers, who were astonished that a foreign tank could survive such rough handling without breakdowns. One report from the Waffenprüfamt stated bluntly, "The American tank is designed for soldiers, not engineers." To German eyes, this was both a compliment and a critique. Their own machines demanded skilled mechanics and factory support. The Sherman, by contrast, could be repaired in the field with basic tools. This simplicity fascinated industrial planners struggling to keep Germany's armored forces operational under constant Allied bombardment. Speer's ministry took particular interest. Production bottlenecks were crippling Germany's tank output, and frontline reports spoke of Panthers immobilized by minor failures. In a closed-door meeting that October, Speer's deputies reviewed the Kummersdorf data. One engineer summarized, "We build for precision, they build for persistence, and persistence is winning." It was an uncomfortable truth. The Sherman was not the best tank in isolation, but the best weapon in a sustained war. Meanwhile, the Allies had quietly obtained full access to the German evaluation through captured correspondence. A courier plane carrying technical documents from Paris to Stuttgart was intercepted over Italy, and the microfilm was recovered intact. When translated, the German commentary stunned U.S. ordnance officers. It contained recommendations on how Germany might improve its own tanks using American-style production methods. The irony was glaring. While Germany sought to emulate the simplicity of the Sherman, the Americans were already refining it further. Armed with this intelligence, Allied engineers accelerated upgrades to the M4 series. The new 76mm gun was prioritized, the wet ammunition storage expanded, and mechanical reliability further improved. It was, in effect, an answer to German criticism derived from their own analysis. By 1944, the Sherman entering service bore the fingerprints of both armies. Its evolution shaped as much by German observation as by American innovation. At Kummersdorf, the German engineers moved on to comparative tests of ammunition. Using captured 75mm U.S. rounds, they analyzed ballistic consistency and found them remarkably uniform, far superior to the late-war German shell production, which suffered from metallurgical shortcuts. The findings were reported to Berlin but largely ignored. Resource shortages left no capacity for reform. By winter, the Sherman was moved indoors for storage, its tires worn, its once glossy green faded to gray. Yet the impact of its presence had spread beyond the test grounds. Panzer divisions in France began receiving new training memos emphasizing reliability, modular assembly, and simplified maintenance. Concepts borrowed directly from the Sherman evaluation. In effect, Germany had learned from the very machine it had mocked as inferior. Allied intelligence analysts, unaware of these internal debates, continued to monitor any references to Beute Panzer M4. Bletchley Park decrypts revealed occasional mentions in communications between German testing bureaus and industry. To British and American analysts, these fragments confirmed a remarkable reality. Their enemy was studying their design with both envy and apprehension. For the German high command, however, such lessons came too late. Industrial doctrine and ideology bound their engineers to complexity. No simplification could compensate for the raw industrial scale of American production. Shermans were rolling off assembly lines by the thousands each month. Still, the quiet respect expressed in the German reports marked a subtle shift. Recognition that the war of machines was no longer about perfection, but about endurance. In the months that followed, that understanding would find its way to the battlefield, where German crews facing endless waves of Shermans would come to realize that the engineers at Kummersdorf had been right. By early 1944, the data gathered from the captured Sherman had filtered through multiple levels of the German war machine. Engineers, production planners, and field officers referenced it constantly in memos and reports. What began as a technical study had become a symbol of contrast, a clear demonstration that the American approach to warfare was fundamentally different from Germany's. At the Panzerwaffe's technical branch in Berlin-Spandau, a comparative report was prepared under the title Beurteilung des amerikanischen Panzertyps M4 im Rahmen der Feindrüstung. It summarized everything learned from the Kummersdorf trials. The conclusions were stark. German tanks, though more powerful, were failing in the field due to logistical exhaustion. Engines overheated, transmissions seized, and spare parts rarely arrived on time. The American tank, by contrast, was built to be repaired anywhere, by anyone, using interchangeable components. The report recommended reforms: simplified drivetrains, modular armor panels, and the adoption of universal spare parts across multiple models. Yet the recommendations were ignored by the Waffenamt. Changing the production system in 1944, with factories bombed daily and resources dwindling, was impossible. Even as engineers admired the Sherman's logic, Germany's war economy remained enslaved to its own complexity. The irony was deepened by the fact that the Allies had already intercepted and translated much of the same report. In late February 1944, an RAF Mosquito reconnaissance flight over Kassel photographed an armaments train destroyed by Allied bombing. Among the wreckage, a captured briefcase contained microfilm copies of the Sherman analysis intended for the Henschel Design Bureau. When British intelligence reviewed the material, it provided an unprecedented insight into German thinking. For the first time, the Allies understood exactly how the enemy assessed their primary battle tank. At the same time, the Americans were implementing their own improvements based on both battlefield experience and the captured German commentary. Engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground incorporated thicker glacis armor and redesigned the transmission axis for easier repair, changes that mirrored observations made by the Germans months earlier. The result was the M4A3, a model that embodied the lessons of both sides. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to document their findings with academic precision. At Kummersdorf, the Sherman was now used as a teaching tool for officer candidates and maintenance instructors. Young engineers were shown how its components fit together, how its suspension absorbed impact, and how its engine could be removed and replaced in hours. Notes from these sessions describe an almost grudging admiration. Though unsophisticated in appearance, this tank is a masterpiece of rational design. One internal report, circulated to the General Staff in April 1944, admitted something remarkable. The enemy's superiority in mass production and repair logistics nullifies any advantage of our higher quality design. Our Panzer must be viewed not as weapons alone, but as part of a system, one currently inferior to theirs. It was an unprecedented acknowledgement, one that few dared to say aloud in Hitler's Germany. Yet even as this quiet realism spread through the technical branches, the propaganda machine maintained the opposite narrative. German newsreels continued to depict the Sherman as a fragile, easily destroyed Tommy Cooker. Soldiers on the front were told it was weak, poorly armored, and clumsy. But within the walls of Kummersdorf, those same claims had been proven false months earlier. When fragments of the German evaluation reached Allied intelligence again through intercepted communications, U.S. analysts marveled at the paradox. The Germans publicly mocked the Sherman while privately admiring its engineering. To them, it was confirmation of victory not yet achieved. The enemy had recognized, if only in secret, that America's industrial approach was unassailable. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, that industrial advantage would reveal its full force. The very tank Germany had studied, dissected, and dismissed would soon appear by the thousands across Normandy, and no amount of analysis could prepare them for the scale of what was coming. By June 1944, the German evaluation of the Sherman had already faded from official attention. Yet the lessons learned from that single captured tank now played out across France in brutal clarity. On the morning of June 6th, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, and behind them came the M4 in overwhelming numbers. The Germans, who had dissected its design for a year, suddenly faced it in its true form. Not as an isolated specimen under laboratory light, but as a relentless industrial tide. From Caen to Saint-Lô, Shermans poured inland faster than German logistics could react. At first, German tank crews held to their training, confident that their Panthers and Tigers could outgun any Allied machine. They were right in theory. On an open field, a Panther's long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over a kilometer away. But what the crews hadn't anticipated, what Kummersdorf's engineers had warned of, was that the Shermans would never come alone. Each engagement revealed the strength of the system the Germans had underestimated. For every Panther that destroyed a Sherman, 3 more appeared. When one broke down, it was repaired overnight. When another was lost, a replacement arrived within days. The battlefield, once defined by German tactical superiority, was now dictated by American logistics and adaptability, the same qualities discovered in that captured tank months earlier. Reports from the front confirmed it. Panzer Regiment 22, engaged near Villers-Bocage, noted in a field diary, "Enemy tanks reappear faster than we can destroy them. Their recovery and repair methods are astonishing." In Berlin, the Armaments Ministry received similar reports, each describing the same phenomenon. The Sherman was not a superior tank individually, but an indestructible concept collectively. Within Allied intelligence, these battlefield outcomes were compared directly to the German test reports captured earlier in the year. The parallels were uncanny. The Germans had described the Sherman as a weapon of persistence, and now in Normandy, that prediction had come true. American logisticians had turned mechanical reliability into a weapon of its own. Fuel, spare parts, and replacement crews flowed seamlessly across the channel. German armor, dependent on long supply lines and specialized parts, was ground down not by better firepower, but by time. By July, as Operation Cobra broke the German line, the contrast became undeniable. Allied analysts studying aerial reconnaissance noted that German tanks often lay abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel, while destroyed Shermans were routinely recovered, repaired, and returned to service. In 1 week alone, U.S. maintenance units in France restored 347 damaged tanks to fighting condition, an impossible figure for the German army. Back in Germany, at the now partially bombed Kummersdorf proving ground, technicians still use the captured Sherman for minor tests. Its engine, despite months of abuse, continued to start on the first try. The last surviving entries in the test log, dated July 1944, read simply, "Operational. Recommend preservation for reference." The note carried a quiet recognition that the tank they had once studied academically had now become the foundation of their defeat. Among Allied commanders, few knew of the German evaluation in detail, but its conclusions had become reality on the ground. The Sherman's speed of production, field repairability, and mechanical simplicity had done what German engineering brilliance could not: sustain a global war. As the German front in France began to collapse under the weight of Allied material, the engineers at Kummersdorf evacuated their records, destroying anything that might aid the enemy. The Sherman, once the centerpiece of their research, was left behind. When Soviet troops reached the area months later, they found it inside a hangar, rusted, scorched by bombing, and marked with faded German crosses. It would take historians years to piece together its significance. But for those who had once studied it, the truth was already clear. The war had not been lost to superior design, but to superior systems, and the captured American tank at Kummersdorf had been the first to reveal that truth. By August 1944, the German High Command had begun to fully grasp what the engineers at Kummersdorf had warned of months earlier. The Allies' strength lay not in a single weapon, but in the machinery of production itself. As the Wehrmacht retreated from France, the battlefield became a living laboratory proving those conclusions. The Sherman, fast to build, simple to maintain, easy to crew, now dominated the ruined roads of northern France in numbers the German staff had once dismissed as impossible. Panzer units reported being overwhelmed not by tactical inferiority, but by exhaustion. Engines overheated from constant retreat, tracks failed under bombardment, and spare parts vanished from supply depots already targeted by Allied aircraft. Each German tank that broke down was one more that would never return to combat. Meanwhile, the Shermans, supported by mobile repair battalions, were back in service within hours. Frontline intelligence units continued forwarding German field observations to Berlin. One report, recovered after the war, summarized it bluntly. American tanks possessed the soul of the factory. Ours possessed the soul of the workshop. It was a poetic description of a practical truth. The Sherman was not beautiful nor invincible, but it was endless. Inside Germany, the engineers who had studied the Sherman could only watch as their findings became prophecy. At Kummersdorf, a small team still analyzed foreign armor designs, even as Allied bombers approached daily. They now worked under severe shortages. No fuel for testing, no replacement parts, no electricity for full operation. In a memo dated August 14th, one engineer wrote, "The Americans have achieved what we cannot, the merging of industrial simplicity with tactical effectiveness. This balance is their decisive weapon." At the same time, Allied intelligence officers reviewing decrypted German communications began to notice a shift in tone. Technical terms like mass production, field recovery, and interchangeable components appeared with increasing frequency in enemy correspondence. The Germans were now using the same language that the Sherman's design had embodied. It was clear that the captured tank had become more than a technical artifact. It had influenced the way German analysts thought about modern warfare itself. In Washington, a quiet but symbolic decision was made in response. The U.S. War Department approved the establishment of a post-war technical archive that would collect both Allied and captured Axis research, including the German Sherman evaluation. The idea was not just to preserve the documents, but to institutionalize the lessons they represented. Wars of the future would be won by those who understood systems, not just machines. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, German tank crews were discovering firsthand the futility of their engineering advantage. Panthers and Tigers, though lethal in combat, could not be replaced quickly enough. Many units resorted to hiding their damaged vehicles in woods to cannibalize them for parts. The Sherman, however, kept rolling. U.S. maintenance crews carried spare engines in trucks, replacing them in the field. The logistical miracle of mass standardization had become as decisive as any weapon. By the time Allied forces crossed the Seine, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority, and German armor was being hunted from above. The same German officers who had once evaluated the captured Sherman now faced its descendants in endless waves, their conclusions vindicated in fire. The concept of a soldier's tank, built not for perfection but for persistence, had become the defining weapon of the Allied advance. In the ruins of Paris, liberated that August, American war correspondents marveled at the sight of lines of Shermans stretching beyond the horizon. Few knew that deep inside Germany, the enemy had once studied this same machine, with technical awe and analytical respect. Even fewer knew that those studies had helped the Allies understand themselves, confirming that the path they had chosen, the path of mechanical pragmatism, was the right one. The German officer who had unknowingly delivered that secret gift, Oberst Karl-Heinz Straube, was still in France when Paris fell. His convoy unit was destroyed in retreat near Metz. He was listed as missing in action, never learning that his careful obedience in 1943 had set in motion one of the most ironic transfers of knowledge in the war, one that changed how both sides fought and how one side ultimately endured. By the autumn of 1944, the echoes of the Kummersdorf evaluation had spread beyond Germany's borders. Allied intelligence, now firmly entrenched in liberated France, had begun collecting every scrap of German technical data left behind in abandoned offices. Among the recovered files in Paris were partial translations of the Sherman study, annotated copies sent to the German Armaments Ministry months earlier. To the astonishment of American analysts, the notes contained detailed diagrams of the tank's internal systems, accompanied by observations that mirrored Allied doctrine word for word. The discovery confirmed what many in Washington already suspected. The Germans had understood precisely why the Sherman worked. They had grasped its core philosophy, even admired it, but could never replicate it because their entire war economy was built on the opposite principle: craftsmanship over scale, precision over repetition. The documents from Paris were sent back to London, where they were analyzed by the Allied Technical Intelligence Committee. The report concluded that the German study had unintentionally validated Allied design priorities, providing a rare glimpse into the enemy's reluctant respect. Inside Germany, the Kummersdorf facility was still operational, though barely. Allied bombers had turned the surrounding countryside into wasteland, and electricity was rationed to a few hours each day. The captured Sherman, battered but functional, now sat half disassembled in a corner hangar, used occasionally for demonstration. Its frame bore the scars of ballistic tests, but its engine still turned over with a sputtering growl that impressed even its critics. Technicians used it to instruct new conscripts in recognizing Allied vehicles, though by now most German soldiers were meeting them on the battlefield instead of in classrooms. One final test report, dated October 21, 1944, carried a quiet resignation. This vehicle is no longer unique. It is typical of what now surrounds us. The engineers who had once treated the Sherman as a curiosity now saw it as an omen. The tank was everywhere, rolling through Belgium, crossing the Rhine, and crushing the German front beneath the weight of industry. Meanwhile, Allied production continued at an incomprehensible pace. In the same month that Germany managed to produce fewer than 400 new tanks, American factories rolled out over 2,000 Shermans. Many of these were improved variants, the M4, A3E, 8, EZ8 among them, equipped with better suspension, thicker armor, and the more powerful 76mm gun. Ironically, some of these upgrades were inspired by weaknesses identified in the very German reports from Kummersdorf. Without realizing it, the Germans had helped refine the weapon that now overwhelmed them. In the field, the contrast between theory and reality grew ever sharper. German tank crews complained that even when they destroyed Shermans in battle, replacements appeared the next day. Panzer divisions fought brilliantly, but bled to exhaustion. The lessons of the Sherman's design, reliability, modularity, endurance, were being demonstrated not in laboratories but across the entire Western Front. By late November, Kummersdorf's remaining personnel began destroying sensitive files. Allied advances from the west and Soviet pushes from the east left no doubt about the outcome. Still, one engineer, identified in later archives as Dr. Werner Dittmar, defied orders and hid several boxes of documentation in a cellar beneath the testing ground. Among them was the complete dossier on the captured Sherman, diagrams, ballistic data, and comparative notes. He scrawled a final line on the cover sheet: "Let future men read this and understand what we did not." Months later, as Berlin burned, those records would be uncovered by advancing American troops. The irony could not have been greater. The same country that had unknowingly provided the Allies with their greatest technical endorsement would now surrender the physical proof of it. When those files reached Washington, their value was recognized instantly. The Office of Scientific Research and Development categorized them under Enemy Technical Reports, Armor, marking the Sherman dossier as not enemy material but confirmation of doctrine. It was an extraordinary statement. The German analysis had not revealed secrets. It had affirmed a philosophy. And that philosophy, already proven in the mud of Normandy and the snows of the Ardennes, would become the blueprint for the next generation of mechanized warfare. By early 1945, the story of the captured Sherman had nearly vanished beneath the chaos of collapsing Germany. Yet the legacy of that single tank and the insight it had inadvertently delivered continued to ripple through the final months of the war. As Allied armies pushed across the Rhine, the principles that German engineers had once admired in secret, modularity, logistics, and mechanical simplicity, were on full display. Every road, every bridge, every shattered town echoed with the clatter of Sherman tracks. In Germany's industrial ruins, what remained of the armaments ministry scrambled to preserve what knowledge it could. Engineers who had once dissected the Sherman now tried to apply its lessons to desperate stopgap measures. Projects like the E-Series tanks aimed to standardize components, reduce production complexity, and mimic the Allied model of mass manufacture. But by that point, it was far too late. Factories lacked raw materials, railways lay in ruins, and fuel shortages crippled any effort to restart production. The Sherman, in effect, had taught Germany what victory required, just as victory slipped forever out of reach. Allied intelligence officers entering captured testing facilities in early March discovered remnants of the same Kummersdorf project. Amid twisted steel and bomb craters, they found fragments of the Sherman's hull, sheets of ballistic data, and half-burned test notes. The Americans who examined the site realized what they were looking at almost immediately: their own machine, studied in forensic detail by the enemy. To them, it was both fascinating and strangely vindicating. The Germans had spent months trying to understand how the Sherman worked, and still it had defeated them through the very qualities they had underestimated. In the United States, the captured German documents, now archived under the codename File Greystone, were analyzed by the U.S. Army Technical Intelligence Service. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground reviewed every line, comparing the German findings to their own wartime data. The result was clear. Both sides had reached the same conclusion independently. Mechanical reliability and standardization were the foundation of modern warfare. The German engineers had confirmed, with brutal honesty, that technological elegance was worthless without industrial endurance. Back in Europe, as the Allied armies advanced toward the Elbe, Sherman units operated with a rhythm that bordered on mechanical inevitability. Damaged tanks were recovered, repaired, and recrewed in days. Factories in France and Belgium began refurbishing Shermans directly behind the front lines, an unprecedented logistical cycle that even surprised the Americans themselves. German divisions trapped by shortages could no longer comprehend the scale of what they faced. For every Panzer lost, 10 Shermans replaced it. Among the scattered German technical staff captured by Allied forces, a few remembered the Kummersdorf Sherman. One engineer told his interrogators, "It was a symbol of what we could not build, a weapon that required no genius to use." His statement was included in the post-war reports as evidence of Germany's strategic failure to industrialize its war machine. At the same time, historians within the Allied Intelligence Corps began to see the captured Sherman story as a lesson in irony. A simple act of routine obedience The transport of a trophy across occupied Europe had unintentionally handed the Allies not a physical advantage, but intellectual confirmation. The Germans had dissected the very weapon that was about to destroy them, written down their analysis, and in doing so, revealed precisely why they were doomed. By April 1945, as American forces entered Berlin, the Sherman's influence had outgrown even its physical form. The tank had become a doctrine, efficiency through simplicity, victory through replication. In the post-war years, those same ideas would shape the American M26 Pershing, the British Centurion, and even Soviet designs derived from studying the captured Kummersdorf archives. Germany's most secret report on the Sherman, intended to improve its own technology, had, through the twists of war, become one of the foundations of Allied armored development for the next generation. The gift Straube had delivered unknowingly in 1943 had changed not just a battle, but an entire philosophy of warfare. By May 1945, Germany lay in ruins, and with it the last vestiges of the world that had birthed the Kummersdorf Sherman. Allied troops swept through the wreckage of testing facilities, finding fragments of tanks, half-melted filing cabinets, and pages of reports that had survived fire only by chance. In one corner of a collapsed hangar, U.S. officers discovered the remains of the captured M4A1, the same tank that had crossed the Mediterranean 2 years earlier. Its once green paint was now blistered, its turret cracked, but the serial numbers were still legible. The Germans had tried to destroy it before fleeing, but even in ruin, it endured. The documents found nearby completed the story. Technical drawings, penetration charts, and ballistic records were recovered intact. The files were cataloged under Allied supervision and sent to London and Washington. There, historians and engineers pieced together the sequence of events that began with a convoy in Tunisia and ended inside a bombed-out laboratory near Berlin. The analysis revealed that the Germans had not only tested the Sherman, they had respected it, learned from it, and even borrowed its design philosophy in their final months. The irony was staggering. The tank that symbolized American industrial mass production had become a model for the very nation that once prided itself on technological superiority. Through a combination of precision, pride, and circumstance, a single German officer had delivered not just a machine, but an idea that simplicity, repeatability, and endurance could defeat even the most advanced engineering. When the captured archives were reviewed at Aberdeen Proving Ground later that year, American analysts described the Kummersdorf reports as one of the most candid technical evaluations ever made by a wartime enemy. The findings were circulated among post-war design teams, influencing how the United States approached armored vehicle development in the coming decades. The M26 Pershing, which replaced the Sherman, incorporated lessons rooted in that analysis, including emphasis on reliability, crew safety, and rapid field servicing. Across the Atlantic, British intelligence officers who had studied the same reports at Farnborough reached similar conclusions. The Germans, they noted, had unconsciously validated the Allied design philosophy. They pursued excellence, we pursued execution. That single sentence would later appear in the British Army's post-war doctrinal review, a quiet acknowledgement of how industrial thinking had eclipsed technical perfection. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, fragments of the same Kummersdorf documents captured by Red Army units were translated and distributed to tank design bureaus in Nizhny Tagil. Soviet engineers, impressed by the Sherman's balance and the German commentary, used both to refine their own emerging T-44 and T-54 designs. Without knowing it, the Germans had contributed to the design lineage of their future adversaries. As for Oberst Karl-Heinz Straube, the man who had unknowingly delivered the Sherman to Germany, no trace of him was ever found. Military archives list him as vermisst, missing, presumed dead, near Metz in late 1944. His name does not appear in any Allied interrogation report or POW manifest, yet his routine mission, executed without question, had reshaped the war more than he could have imagined. In 1946, the U.S. Army published an internal memorandum summarizing the significance of the captured Kummersdorf materials. It concluded with a line that would later be quoted in military journals. The enemy sought to understand our weapon, and in doing so, explained his own defeat. That statement became the quiet epitaph of the story, one rarely told because it required no hero, no great battle, and no triumphal declaration. It was the story of how a single misplaced trophy turned into one of the most profound exchanges of knowledge in modern warfare. When the war ended, the surviving Sherman hull from Kummersdorf was shipped to the United States for display at Aberdeen. There, it sat for decades, its history known only to a handful of archivists. Visitors saw only another war relic, unaware that this battered machine had once sat under German lights, measured and tested, while engineers unknowingly wrote the technical obituary of the very army that studied it. It was not a weapon that changed the war, it was understanding. And that, more than any shell or engine, was the true power the Germans had given away. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.